Good Monday morning, everyone. Today is February 10th, 2020, and here is today's Monday Morning Minute. For today, we will look back at last week's readings, which had to do with developing positive parent, community/teacher relationships. We'll then talk about this week's readings, which have to do with working with diverse learners. And then I will talk a little bit about our teaching metaphor project that is due this Sunday, February 16th. Just keep in mind we do not have a critical response this week since we have one of our major assignments due. So last week we thought about all of the ideas presented in the readings having to do with building relationships not only among students, but also with parents, with caregivers, with the broader community at large. And we had some really interesting ideas to share. So first, Caitlin tells us, there's one idea specifically in our reading that I am eager to see how they work for me after I try them. The first one being an introductory phone call. If it is a new student to my load, I will use this time to inform the families of how I do things in my classroom. Although they have the opportunity to come see my room on back to school night, I feel like this would be a great thing to do for my students and their families, especially since next year I will have a totally different group of students, so most of the parents won't know me. Caitlin, I love this idea, and I love the idea of kind of going above and beyond the back to school night and being proactive about reaching out to parents. And I would also suggest too, as you think about calling new families in order to inform the families of how you do things in your classroom, this might be a chance too to not only inform but to also seek more information and to perhaps get some ideas of the student and their past and their history, kind of make it sort of a two-way street, so it's not simply, I'm telling the parents what I do in my classroom, but what are their goals for their child that I can perhaps be of assistance with. And then turning to Doug. Doug, you talked a lot about data, and I am just going to quote you for a second. You wrote, "Data is a great tool for communication, and it also can make you seem like the smartest person in the room if you have information that no one else has. I lean on my classroom data when talking with anyone that has an interest in a student or curriculum. It is easy to discount unforeseen negativity with data. It is also a pitfall to stand on data alone and can have an opposite impact on collaboration." And I thought this was a really nuanced take on the importance of data. So yes, it can be super helpful to present it as we saw, our authors discussed last week. But I also appreciate that you're saying data alone kind of won't save us, especially in tricky situations, right? It's data and collaboration, data and constant communication. So thank you for that reminder. I also wanted to just bring up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I am guessing that both of you all in the classrooms right now probably are familiar with this idea. But Caitlin, your example of the mother that you're in constant contact with really made me think about how, this hierarchy of needs is obviously true for our students. The idea being that if these physiological needs, these base level needs are not met, it's really hard to kind of climb up the ladder towards, self-actualization. But I was thinking about it in the context of parents too, right? Parents are also people. And if some basic physiological needs amongst our parents and community members that we're in communication with are not met, it's also hard for them to get to the level where perhaps we want them in terms of thinking objectively about their students' progress, right, and taking our advice seriously. So just something that's, I think, maybe helpful to keep in mind because obviously when we work with parents and caregivers, we want to sort of lead with humility, right? Speaking of that, kind of building on this theme of humility, building on this theme of just kind of being reflective about our own practices in class. This week, we'll be talking about working with diverse learners. And I should say, I wish that this had come a little earlier in the semester because I'm a big proponent of sort of starting with thinking about diverse learners or having them in mind from the beginning rather than kind of as an add-on later, because when we think about classroom management, I think specifically about being culturally responsive in our classrooms. So again, the ideas presented in these readings are absolutely key, and I would hope would form the foundation of your classroom management in whatever context you find yourself in. So we have 3 brief-ish articles, and the first is from the Washington Post, and when you notice it, you'll just see kind of large gaps, like blank spaces where ads would have gone, so apologies for that. It's not a very long article. And it's about just federal data released. This article came out in 2018 that just shows that racial disparities are growing when we look at management in classrooms. And so from the article, we hear from someone named Caitlin Banner, who works with the National Advancement Project, who, looking at this data, then says, "We know from many other studies that there are no discernible differences in the way that Black students behave in school. The disparities come from the way that adults in the school building are responding to the student behavior." And here she's responding to, again, the data that shows that Black and brown students and students with disabilities are over-disciplined in schools, meaning that given their population, their percentage of the population, we see them suspended and expelled and even just sent out of the classroom at rates far higher than you would expect. In this article, we learned, for instance, that Black students are about 15% of the population, and yet account for something like 31% of expulsions. And again, here, Caitlin Banner is reminding us it's not that Black and brown kids are more prone to misbehavior. It is that people seek out that misbehavior. People notice that misbehavior far more often than they do with their white counterparts. And again, it's Black and brown students primarily. They also talk about students with disabilities. That's another important layer to this problem. So Ballinget kind of talks about this problem, and these other two readings help us figure out solutions. What can we do in the context of our own classrooms to not repeat this problem, to not exacerbate it? So first we have the Teaching Tolerance. It's a toolkit. It's called Reframing Classroom Management. And it's several pages long, but the idea here is that there are just a ton of different resources to help us as educators rethink our practices when it comes to management. As they say, reframing classroom management requires an understanding of what is realistic to expect of the whole child based on what we know of their personal circumstances, the message their behavior sends, and their developmental level. So the idea here with this toolkit is that I think it's pretty accessible. It's something you can kind of look through, maybe, given its different components, you can maybe look at sort of one list before you, I guess, teach for the day, and then maybe during your lunch break. Like, it's pretty palatable, maybe in smaller chunks. And our second project, just to give you a little heads up about this, I'm going to be asking you all to create a toolkit based on an issue related to classroom management that interests you. And so this Teaching Tolerance article is kind of what I have in mind. They're talking about reframing classroom management from a social justice perspective. Your toolkit will have a different topic in mind, likely. But again, that's just kind of a model for what I'm looking for the second assignment. So again, just a preview there. And then finally, we have a piece from the Steinhardt School of Education at NYU, and it's called Culturally Responsive Classroom Management Strategies. And I mentioned this term culturally responsive earlier, and I'm hoping that it's a term that's familiar to all of us here. But if it's not, I think this piece kind of gives you a good overview of what we're talking about, responding in a culturally resonant way with our students. So they recommend 4 distinct strategies here. First of all, recognizing our own cultural lens and biases, things that appear to be common sense, quote unquote, things that might appear to be just basic respect, quote unquote, are actually very cultural. And so if a student is coming in from a different cultural background, something that might be in line with respectful behavior in their own culture may look very differently in the classroom, and again can kind of lead to these disparities that we see widespread in public education. So their second tip is that we need knowledge of our students' cultural backgrounds. We should always be learning about our students. We of course need to proceed with an awareness of the broader social, economic, and political context. And finally, we as teachers have to be able and willing to use culturally appropriate management strategies in the classroom. And each of these is explained in this article, and there's a page of references at the end of the article with more information for you. So for this week, we have our teaching metaphor project. It is due on Sunday, February 16th by 11:59 p.m. You can upload it to Blackboard. And of course, if you have questions about this, please let me know. I went over it a couple weeks ago in an announcement, but of course, if specific questions crop up, know that I am here. I hope you all have a wonderful week, and I will see you back here next week.